Goebbels, the Nazis, the East Germans would have loved the internet because it would make the job a great deal easier. If you look at the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, into the 60s, propaganda really was somewhat harder to make. First of all, there were limited channels of information. So in the past, what happened is if I was a crackpot, I was the local Nazi in some small American town, I was pretty quiet about it because everybody would look at me and say, I'm a crackpot. Well, what happens now? Now I'm on the internet, and I'm part of the international group of crackpots.
It sounds like it was quite the accident, but would you say you have enjoyed the path? If you could go back, would you do it again, knowing what you know now?
Oh, I found it, quite interesting. And as I said, one of the things, if you're a professor, is that you need to occasionally write books and articles, and it helps if not everybody else in the field is trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it worked out really rather well. It was a kind of a niche in the field, and one thing led to another. I didn't have any master plan at the beginning, but I'd finish one project, and then something else would look interesting, so I'd do that, and then something else came along. So yeah, it was both interesting and, professionally helpful.
Yeah. And your more modern day research, are you still studying Nazi and East German propaganda, or have you expanded that at all?
Well, I retired some years back, and so I haven't been interested in, writing or publishing too much. What I have kept going is my online propaganda archive, which you obviously discovered. And I find myself occasionally making unpleasant comparisons between past and present. So, the interest hasn't diminished, but I no longer have the interest in, the books and articles side of things.
I guess this is a good broaching point, but, a lot of people do talk about similarities between modern day propaganda and historical examples. I guess I'm curious from your perspective, with all of your expertise, would you say that they are unwarranted claims, or would you say that these are accurate warning calls?
Oh, the comparisons are obviously there. There are very significant differences. Goebbels, the Nazis, the East Germans would have loved the internet because it would make the job a great deal easier. But the basic techniques of propaganda really aren't all that much different than they were then. The techniques and the methods, the technologies are somewhat different. Probably actually the best book still on propaganda, it's an old book published in the 1960s, is by a chap named Jacques Ellul, E-L-L-U-L, who was a French writer, Propaganda, the Foundation of Men's Attitudes. It's a general study of propaganda, and even though the book is 50 years old at this point, if you read it, it still very much applies to the present day. So yeah, the parallels are there. They've changed given circumstances. But if anything, propaganda is more deadly today and more effective than it was in the days of, say, Hitler.
This kind of touches on some of the questions that were being asked in the community. I'm curious, kind of the distinction between regular political communication, between bureaucracy and propaganda. What makes something propaganda as compared to everyday functions of government?
That, of course, is an entertaining question and not easy to answer. There's the old line that Justice Potter Stewart on the Supreme Court used about pornography. He said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Well, in some ways, the same is true of propaganda. It is a subset of persuasion or rhetoric, but the question is, how do you distinguish it? And I think probably the basic characteristics are is that propaganda is part of an overall system. That is, if I'm running for office locally and I give speeches, I put out advertising and so forth, that's political persuasion. It's probably not useful to speak of it as propaganda because propaganda is a much more comprehensive system. Something, by the way, Ellul talks about in considerable detail. If, on the other hand, I'm running a system in which not only am I giving a speech, but I'm determining who carries it, I'm getting rid of those who disagree with me, I am repeating it over and over again through a variety of channels, I think propaganda is distinguished in part by the sheer comprehensiveness of its methods and channels.
Okay, that makes sense. Would you say a lot of the messaging coming out of, well, I'm an American, so specifically for me, I would be focusing on the American context, but I guess I'll ask more generally. Do you notice the messaging coming out across certain political vibes that are more propaganda based versus pure political messaging based? Like, for example, the incoming American administration is making a lot of claims and statements regarding things like immigration, regarding budgets, regarding minorities. So I guess I'm curious, when you hear about things like that, when you look at things like that, would you say that's more political messaging to pander to their base, or was that more propaganda, or is it kind of one and the same?
Well, again, it's a rather complicated answer, so don't hesitate to interrupt or do a follow-up. But I think part of it, we have to look at the differences in context. If you look at the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, into the 60s, propaganda really was somewhat harder to make because, first of all, there were limited channels of information. And so, for instance, if you were Hitler and people read the German newspapers, they realized there was a propaganda content behind it, okay? It was pretty clear, and they were appropriately suspicious. Although you can't be suspicious about everything because otherwise nothing happens. And the other thing is that even the Nazis had people called editors. Now, editors are among the unsung heroes of civilization because what editors do is, if they're good, is they, first of all, fix the basic mistakes writers make. But second, they enforce some kind of standard. You know, even the Nazis had editors, and if someone said something absolutely ridiculous, a Nazi editor might well say, well, let's not quite do it that way, okay? And if you look at the traditional media, newspapers, magazines, radio, and so forth, books, there were editors. And editors, as I said, are in part a barrier against complete and utter nonsense. Now, with the development of the internet, editors disappeared. You don't have an editor. You know, you can say the most outrageous things if you wanted to, put it on your various channels, and people might say, she's crazy, ridiculous, or whatever, but nobody's going to stop you from saying it.
Yeah.
Furthermore, what happens is that in the past, since there were limited channels of information, you know, you got a certain, at least in the mass media, a mid-range. I mean, there'd be to the left, it'd be to the right, but there was a broad spectrum, and the absolute crazies at either end didn't get coverage. Well, of course, now that doesn't happen because everybody has his own media channel and nobody has any editors. Furthermore, of course, the internet provides people through those lovely algorithms with what they want. And so, well, I mean, recently I made a terrible mistake on Facebook. I use Facebook because I like to know what my friends are doing, and I generally avoid too much political content. But I made the mistake of commenting on something, and suddenly Facebook thought, gee, he must be interested in all these, you know, weird right-wing guys. So I've been, you know, banning everything that came along, and it's gradually diminishing. But the point is that you get everything that you want. Unfiltered, no editors. The editor is yourself. You're fed what you want. So in the past, what happened is if I was a crackpot, you know, I was the local Nazi in some small American town, I was pretty quiet about it because everybody would look at me and say, I'm a crackpot. Well, what happens now? Now I'm on the internet, and I'm part of the international group of crackpots. We reinforce each other. I only hear from other crackpots because, you know, the various social media feedback, loops and so forth, just give me what I want to hear. And now I'm important. I am part of this great international movement. The consequence, and there's about 20 different threads we could follow in that, but the consequence is that propaganda, we are much easier to fool now than we were in the 1930s. That's why Goebbels and such would love the internet. We are just much more easily duped because we only get what we want. We don't get any disagreement from the channels we follow.